So we've been doing a couple Neville videos again. I'm as surprised as you are. There's been a lot of interesting stuff on my mind in regards to Neville's approach actually the last week, which, as I said, is a surprise. But if you've watched the recent videos, car videos, including you can listen obviously to the podcast episode I did yesterday concerning the idea of like it is done or it's over, right? This is all, law of assumption type stuff. And I'm making today's video because tomorrow or the next day, probably the next video after this is going to be Cecilia and I are planning on speaking tomorrow on Zoom like we did recently. Cecilia was the moderator of the Neville subreddit. And so I kind of want to just go over one or two things that we're going to, in all likelihood, discuss. And why Neville's been on my mind recently, his approach. Because if you're relatively new to this channel, just so you know, I am not like certainly not a Neville coach or like a person who thinks that Neville is, a master and better than every other manifesting teacher or spiritual teacher whatsoever. I like bringing in different teachers, and while I love Neville, I love a lot of these other manifesting teachers, pretty much just as much, if not more so. But Neville, nonetheless, is one of the most, if not the most, far out and provocative manifesting teachers that you'll ever encounter, especially here in modern times, right? And so what's been going on recently for me, and why I wanted to have Cecilia come back on to chat. Cecilia's always good to talk to about this stuff, but why I thought it'd be good to have her back on to talk about this stuff is Cecilia, as we mentioned last time in passing in our conversation, Cecilia likes a lot of the later Neville lectures. She's read that stuff for a long time, is pretty familiar with them, and she still reads them like I think almost every day, little portions of them. I am very much a fan of Neville's earlier stuff. I think that his promise experience really muddled his later teachings, his later lectures. Certainly wasn't as practical. I don't think anyone would deny that. The practicality was definitely there more for at least most people in his earlier teachings. Specifically, like if we look at like the 5 lessons lectures, I'll put a link to the mini course above. We recently went over, the techniques that Neville shares there. But anyway, Cecilia was sharing with our text chain just some of the things that Neville was saying in this lecture from, like, I think 1969. And one of the things that we noticed and that Cecilia and I started talking about was that Neville basically at the end of his career, like near the end of his life, and I think just in general post-promise basically, don't quote me on this, but generally speaking, he was like, you just do the imaginal act once and that's it. It's done. You can only plant the seed once. You plant the seed once and either it comes up or it doesn't come up. That's it. It's done. But he said you plant it once, it's going to come up eventually, at the appointed hour, right? And what's interesting is like, he said that he always just did the imaginal act once, which I was like, what? Is that true? Like, that's not what I remember reading and seeing. Like I said in the video the other day, like in The Power of Awareness, he gives that example of the anonymous soldier, which was him in, who wanted to get out of the army. And he talks about, night after night, imagining, reenacting the scene of being back at home with his wife and daughter in New York City. And after 8 nights, he was honorably discharged. But when he tells the story, that's in The Power of Awareness. You look there. But when he tells the story later in his career, like I think The Law of Liberty, Maybe he tells it there. He tells it other places, multiple places. I think he tells it later in his career. He says, I just did the Imaginal act once. He goes, I imagined being back home, at night, when I went to bed that night in the barracks in the army, and that around 4 a.m. I got up and, at 4 a.m. like he awoke, he had like a vision of the discharge paper saying approved. And he's like, that's it. He knew, the relief, like we're talking about, that relief, that keen sense of relief. It's over. And that was it. And then he said the next several days, he just waited to get discharged. Maybe this is getting in the weeds a little bit. Maybe it's like, he still was, of course, sleeping, I guess, in bed in New York City, but it doesn't matter. The point is, this is nuanced, right? The point is, he's saying he just did it once. And in this lecture that Cecilia and I were discussing, he says he always just did the Imaginal act once. He didn't do it over and over again. And Cecilia's like, that doesn't seem right. Like when he, was trying to get remarried, basically, right? He needed a divorce from his first wife. There's that great Neville story about that. His wife, who he had been separated for like 15 years or whatever. And the bridge of incidents is really interesting there. But Cecilia was like, didn't he sleep imagining he was already married to her for like several nights in a row? The point is, most of us, the way we traditionally look at Neville, certainly Neville, the 5 lessons stuff, the stuff from the 1940s and early 50s, the stuff we read about in the case histories and the power of awareness and read about in the Law and the Promise, that the case histories there, people are doing their imaginal act over and over again, night after night, most of the time. There are examples of people just doing the Imaginal act once, and then their manifestation comes, a couple days later, or a week later, or a month later. But generally speaking, the case histories that Neville gives, or when you go on like a place like the Neville subreddit, people are doing sats and reenacting their imaginal scene night after night, every day. Sometimes people do it multiple times a day, or at least, once every couple of days. And this is very different from a practical approach point, okay? If you practice this stuff, if you've actually done this stuff. This is very different than doing your sats once, doing the imaginal scene once, invoking that fulfillment, had that feeling of it's done. Oh, it's over, it's done. That completeness, going to sleep or whatever, like having that fulfillment, and that's it. It's done. Later in his career, Neville said, that's it. It's done. It's fucking done. Why would you do this scene again? Why would you do it the next night? Why would you do it the following night? It's already done. It's already planted. It's done. Now, traditionally, the way most people look at Neville, including me until this time, until now, is the reason we do an imaginal scene over and over again, night after night, is because we lose faith. It's like we plant the seed that night, and it's like it's done, right? But the next day we start, or the next day or a couple days later or whatever, we start worrying, oh, is it really going to happen? When is it going to happen? Maybe it's not going to happen. We dig up that fucking seed. We dig up that seed. We start digging up that seed. And often we dig up that seed so much that it's gone. No plant ever grows, and that the manifestation never comes. So the idea, I think, of doing a scene over and over again, sats, with for fulfillment of a fulfilled specific desire, night after night, is to get that sense it's happening. But Neville says, later in his career, correctly, you can only do it once. You can only fucking plant something once. Once it's planted, either it grows or it doesn't grow. But if you plant it and know it's going to grow because you planted, you felt it, the manifestation is going to happen, it's going to happen. He had that certainty and conviction that it's going to happen, and that, enabled it to happen quickly. When we are doing sats night after night, it's almost to build that conviction and certainty. But Neville said, really, you plant something once, you see it in your mind's eye, it's done. You can actually remember back on that. I'll post to a video above, a podcast episode above, where I talk about this, like playing with the time sense. You can make the future, your fulfilled event, or after your fulfilled event, right? You can make that the past. So like, let's give a cliche example. Let's say I want a new car, right? So I do, I get into that state akin to sleep, and I am I feel it. I really feel it. I really do it. And I get that feeling of it's done. I have the new car. It's done. It's done. I'm fully confident it's going to show up in my 3D reality. Okay? Because it's done. I have it. I had that moment of release of where I know it's done. What Neville is saying is that moment's all you need. I can look back at that moment. If I start having doubts or whatever tomorrow, all I have to do is look back at that moment that I already had of, oh yeah, it's done. I already did this. It's already done. Of course it's coming into 3D. I've already have it. It's already done. Do you see what I'm saying here? I hope I'm making some sense. This is why I want to make this video, because Cecilia and I are probably just going to jump right into the weeds with this when we start talking tomorrow, because we're both prone to do that. This is very, very interesting. And I also want to thank, the commenter on the video the other day that said, who mentioned that Law of Liberty lecture that Neville said, I only did this once for getting out of the Army. Because I was like, oh, wait, you're right. He did just say that in that lecture and in other lectures. He claims later in his career, basically, and it might just be because he's describing things that happened 20, 30 years before, because he doesn't remember them in the same way or whatever. He claims that he basically just planted the seed once. In this Cecilia lecture that we were texting about, someone asked him this question, I don't like doing sats night after night. It gets boring. The first time I plant the seed, it's exciting, but then the night after night, it doesn't. And Neville goes, well, why would you do that? He goes, the Law and the Promise, for that book, he's like, I got all these stories and people were doing that and were successful doing that. He's like, that's not what I do. He goes, I plant the seed once and I know it's done. It's a very different practical approach if you're going that angle. I mentioned, I think last week in a video or something like that, Amanda Francis, she's one of the best modern manifesting teachers there is. A better manifesting teacher than any person talking about Neville, basically, these days. She was talking about this idea of like, I've been done with this. Like, it's already done. I've been done with this. It's already done. That's the same thing. And a lot of different manifesting teachers throughout, the last 100 years have talked about this in different ways. Neville's is the most dramatic. And when you feel that release that it's done, the suggestion you're making to yourself is it's fucking done. So it's done. And if that's your continual suggestion as the days passed, it's going to flower in your world. I personally always had trouble with sats doing for a specific thing, because I would do it once, feel that release, but then I can never repeat it. I mean, I would try to repeat it, but to get that fulfillment night after night, I can never do that. And this points out one reason why. Because the fulfillment already fucking happened the first time. You planted the seed. Now you're digging up the seed, trying to plant more seeds. It's stupid. I want to read why people have success when they do repeat it over and over again, and why you don't have to. This is from 5 Lessons to Questions and Answers. And again, he changed his tune later in his career. 20 years after this, he would probably have a very different answer, or a different answer, I would say, than he has here. This is from 1948. Someone asked him, how often should I perform the Imaginal act? A few days or several weeks? Now, later in his career, he would probably say, you just do it once and wait to the appointed hour. Here, and this is what people are more familiar with, he says, in the book of Genesis, the story is told of Jacob wrestling with an angel. This story gives us the clue we are looking for, that when satisfaction is reached, impotence follows. When the feeling of reality is yours, for the moment at least, you are mentally impotent. The desire to repeat the act of prayer is lost, having been replaced by the feeling of accomplishment. You cannot persist in wanting what you already have. If you assume you are what you desire to be to the point of ecstasy, you no longer want it. Your imaginal act is as much a creative act as a physical one, wherein man halts, shrinks, and is blessed. For a man creates his own likeness. For as a man creates his own likeness, so does your imaginal act transform itself into the likeness of your assumption. If, however, you do not reach the point of satisfaction, repeat the action over and over again until you feel as though you touched it and virtue went out of you. So what happens to a lot of us, I would say, is that we maybe reach that point of satisfaction, but then we start having doubts. And so then we have to do SATs again, right? That's the traditional Neville way. But a different way of looking at it, the later Neville way of looking at it, is more like you did it once, it's done. You just got to remember you've done it. And I mean, of course, you could do SATs to do that, but I hope you're gleaning the nuances in what I'm talking about. And you really have to be probably familiar with Neville's approach and having done SATs yourself to appreciate what we're discussing here. When I say SATs, I don't just mean an imaginal scene. It could also be like, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. If I feel thank you, if I keep on saying thank you, that I have something I want, right? A specific thing like thank you, thank you. There's nothing, I'm just saying thank you or whatever. It comes out of me. It's done. I have it. I just have to remember that it's done. I don't have to say thank you, thank you, thank you every night for that. All right, this was a long video. The next video after this will probably be Cecilia and I talking more about this and getting in the weeds about it. If you have any questions you want me to ask her and you see this video when it's posted, you can email me at info@radicalcounselor.com, and I will try to ask them those questions that you email me. Anything else, let me know. And until next time, happy trails.